Welcome back to the Election Year Survival Guide. We are going through discipleship opportunities presented by elections. And in this lesson, we are going to talk about how to think about government the way God does. Now, why is this important? Throughout the course of this course, we have talked about the challenges and the temptation to make kind of politics an idol and to care too much about it and to allow it to do things or to expect it to do things that God doesn't really expect it to do. But there's also another temptation that we have to address within the church, and that is those who really just don't care, who think too little about government. It's important that we see the entire world as God does and to see it brought under his dominion, and that of course includes everything that he created, which includes government. So a few thoughts on how to make that happen is first recognizing that God created three institutions, and the family, the church, and the government, and he expects different things of them. Each of these have distinct purposes. He created the family for, of course, procreation, to raise people. He created the church to carry out the Great Commission, disciple nations, and he created government, as Romans 13 tells us, to reward what is good and to punish what is evil. There's challenges, of course, if we expect any one of those institutions to perform the function of different institutions, and often that's frankly one of the criticisms of government. Well, the government can't change people's hearts and evangelize. Well, we know that. God knows that. That's not why he created government. He created government for a different purpose. That doesn't mean it's not a meaningful purpose. And just because it doesn't have the job of carrying out the Great Commission doesn't mean it doesn't have an important job that we need to recognize and steward, right? So God created all three of these institutions, which brings us to our second point. Just because government does bad things doesn't make it irredeemable. Now, in the public conversation around government, a lot of it is very, very negative. And that has created the impression in many cases that, well, government is just icky. And so we're going to stay away from it. Now, again, having established that God created three institutions, the family, the church, and the government, we are well aware that all of those institutions have the capacity for tremendous good and tremendous evil. And we have seen all of those happen in each institution. And so I think the biblical balanced perspective of government is not to look at all the negative things that happen there and say, therefore we will stay away, but to see those as, in many cases, evidence that, well, maybe the gospel is not reigning supreme in that sphere, so maybe we need to give it more attention so that it in fact performs the function that God gave to it. Now, if something is inherently bad, we try to get rid of it and we try to eliminate it. We cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and if there are high places that are altars to false gods, we just destroy them. Government is not in the sphere of a high place to a false god. So the goal is not obliteration. The goal is submission of that institution to God's will. Now, that brings us to our next point about the proper role of government, that God did not intend the government to be supreme among the institutions. Now, we've established that God created the family, he created the church, and he created the government. Each of those fulfills different purposes. They have different functions in God's universe, all of which are supposed to be submitted to ultimately God. Now, in an increasingly secularizing culture, what happens? We remove God. We know that nature abhors a vacuum. So who's ultimately in control? Well, government tries to take that spot. And when it does, then government believes itself to be over the family and over the church. And that's where you see lots of meddling, and we all know the many examples of how that is taking place. So it's in the best interest of the family and the church for government to assume its rightful place under ultimately the lordship of God's creation and to function within the constraints that God intended for government. It certainly has an important role, but it should not exceed the lane that God created for government. And that leads us to our next point, that Christians should desire to see government fulfill its God-given purposes. That's what we want for government. We don't want it to be supreme among the institutions. We don't want it to have no role in the world, because God created it to have a role. We don't want to expect too much of it. We don't want to expect too little of it. We want to see it fulfill the purpose that God created for it, which ultimately is to encourage goodness and to discourage evil. And in the world we live in today, where we are very often calling good evil and evil good, to our great shame, we see government actually fulfilling the opposite of the purpose that God created it for, where government is actually encouraging evil and it is discouraging what is good. And that is evidence that it is not fulfilling the purpose God created for it. And that is also evidence that we as believers have a lot of work to do for that to change. And that, of course, should be our goal. And that'll lead us to our final point here. Ultimately, Christians must obey God and not government. Because God created government, and government behaves properly only when it serves the purpose God created for it, we cannot do things God tells us not to do, even if government tells us to do it. Now, this, of course, there's a lot to say about this idea of when is the right time to submit to the governing authorities. And we know that we must submit under circumstances when even the government is, not good people who don't necessarily honor Jesus. But just because the government tells us something does not mean we have to obey if it is in violation of something that God has told us we must do, or an encouragement not to do things we must do, or a requirement that we do things God has forbidden us from doing. And there's a huge gray area there as well. How do we understand that? We're not going to get into right now. That might be a future episode. But ultimately, the understanding that if we have to choose, our allegiance is to God and not government. And wisdom requires us to prayerfully, humbly, of course, take that before the Lord and find out we know when is the right time to engage in civil disobedience, because our conscience and our obligation to God requires us to, and when is the time to submit to the governing authorities. It's not always easy, but it's necessary, and it's necessary in particular because we recognize that government does come from God. It fulfills a legitimate purpose in his kingdom, in the world that he created. And because of that, we have to both submit to it and we have to steward it when given the opportunity. And by God's grace, we have been given that opportunity.